Okay, hello everyone. It's nice to be back with you again. Um, you may remember from my last talk, I was the sciences photographer at Simon Fraser University for 36 years. I became interested in native plants sometime around 1970, so it's been a long time. And almost immediately, I started coming across references to David Douglas. And it pretty quickly became obvious that he was pretty significant to the botany of our area. And but the stories I was getting about him were bits and pieces here and there. And it wasn't until about a year ago when I came across his diary published online that I was able to get the full story of his travels in North America. And I decided at that point to try and figure out a way of doing a talk about based on that diary. The problem is that all my talks in the past have been using my own photographs and my own words. Tonight, I'm afraid you're going to be part of a bit of an experiment because I've had to find illustrations for the diary in books and online and wherever I could. And I'm actually going to be narrating from his diary. And I'm just not sure how any of that's going to go. So I think it'll be okay. The diary reads like a huge adventure story. And I easily could have made this a 3 or even 4-part talk. There is so much in that diary. But as it is, I've had to be selective. And so we will jump around a little bit. Hopefully that won't be too obvious. So all the photographs of flowers and birds that I used tonight are my photographs. All the other illustrations are from a wide range of other sources. So Douglas, he had a career that only lasted 9 years, from 1825 to 1834. He made the first systematic botanical collections of flora and fauna over many parts of Western North America. And so it's the story of that career, using his own words from the diary, that is going to be the basis of this talk tonight. I borrowed the title Traveler in a Vanished Landscape from the book by William Morwood, because I think that line gives the best description of Douglas' time in our area. Now we have a few contemporary drawings of Douglas. Perhaps this is the most accurate, drawn by his niece. As you can see down at the bottom corner here, it's signed by his niece, Miss Atkinson. Now, David Douglas was born in 1799 near Perth, Scotland, in a village of Scone. And Scone itself was a site of immense historic significance because Scottish kings had been crowned there since 858. A palace was established in Scone, and that palace has been the home to the Earls of Mansfield for over 400 years. When David was 3 years old in 1802, David William Murray, the current Earl of Mansfield, commissioned an extension to the palace. The original Scone Palace was located immediately adjacent to the village of Scone. And with the plan enlarged palace plus the extension to the palace grounds, this made it necessary to demolish the entire village of Scone, and David's family was forced to move. So David subsequently found himself attending school in the nearby community of Kinule, but the 3-mile walk to the school provided too many distractions. So school was not a success for Douglas. He frequently was punished for coming late, for not knowing his lessons, for skipping classes. He kept birds as pets, including hawks and owls. And when he couldn't catch mice to feed them, he bought bullock's liver for them with his own lunch money. Rather than school, he preferred to spend his time in the woods and fields around Kinule. So as a child, David already had a broad interest in nature, but his focus on plants began when at the age of 12, he was apprenticed to the head gardener at Scone Palace. He spent 7 years in this position. He completed his apprenticeship, and it was in the library at Scone Palace that he finally developed an interest in books, mostly botany manuals. He actually returned to school and spent a winter at a college in Perth to learn more about the scientific aspects of plant culture. In 1818, he was hired as a gardener by Sir Robert Preston. Preston must have been quite a character because he was a wealthy ship owner and he was known as Floating Bob. And he's described as big as 2 men and eats like 3. That's really not significant to our talk tonight, but I thought it was interesting. But Sir Robert had an extensive botanical library, which David took full advantage of. And it was here that he developed his lasting interest in exotic plants. That is, plants that were not native to Scotland. But now David was on the move. After only 2 years with Robert Preston, he moved to the brand new Royal Botanic Gardens at Glasgow. And here he became a student of Professor William Jackson Hooker, who was chair of botany at Glasgow University, and who would later become the director of Kew Gardens in London and the major player in the botanical affairs of Great Britain. In 1823, Hooker recommended Douglas to London's Royal Horticultural Society, and Hooker was so influential that David was immediately hired, age 24, and he was first assigned to go to China, but it turned out that there was wars going on there, and those plans fell through. So instead, he was sent to the Northeast United States and Upper Canada. His assignment there was to assess new and promising garden plants. But he also had a great interest in the native plants of the New World. Douglas began keeping his journal even before he left England, and he made daily entries throughout his travels. That journal, covering the years 1823 to 1827, was published in 1914. And the publisher explained the 90-year delay in saying that the handwriting was difficult to read. And that's probably a pretty good indication of the difficult conditions under which Douglas was making his entries. So as I say, the original entries in the journal make compelling reading. You can find this online, and if you're interested, it would be worth going through it. They give an eyewitness account of conditions in our area and a graphic idea of the difficulties of travel at that time. And I'm going to be quoting from the diary throughout the talk. So on June 3rd, 1823, he departed Liverpool for North America. His instructions were to find new plants for British farms and gardens. Now, North America, or Eastern North America, was pretty well settled at that time, and this trip went pretty smoothly. So I'm going to kind of skip over it, but I just wanted to recount one episode that happened in Canada. One day he hired a horse and buggy and a guide. And when Douglas climbed a tree to collect specimens of a mistletoe, the guide stole his coat and wallet and ran off, leaving the horse and buggy. This presented a problem because it was a French horse. Douglas writes in his journal, "I had to hire a man to take me back as I could not drive. The horse, only understanding the French language, I could not talk to him in his tongue, which placed me in an awkward situation." So after only 4 months in Eastern North America, he was back in Britain, arrived in January 1824. So that trip was considered a success by the Horticultural Society and by Douglas. And in the same year, Douglas again found himself on his way to North America. But this time he was headed for the mouth of the Columbia River. He says, "I embarked on board the Hudson's Bay Company's brig William and Anne, destined for the entrance of the River Columbia." And the red line here shows the route of the William and Anne. It would be possible to do an entire hour's talk just on the events of that trip. For example, he at a stop in Rio de Janeiro, Douglas commented on the numerous orchids. And then trying to round Cape Horn, the ship battled for 10 days in that rough latitude just to get around the tip of South America. So after a voyage of 8.5 months, if you can imagine, 8.5 months, Douglas described this as long and tedious. They finally reached the Hudson's Bay Company, Fort Vancouver, on the Columbia River. It was April 7th, 1825, and this was the beginning of an odyssey that would take Douglas over more than 7,000 miles. Douglas was only the third naturalist to visit the west coast of North America. He had been preceded by Archibald Menzies, who traveled with Captain Vancouver in 1792, and Lewis and Clark in 1803. And virtually the first plant he noted was the tree that would eventually carry his name. He recognized it immediately from Menzies' description. Archibald Menzies had visited the coast with Captain Vancouver only 33 years earlier, and Douglas had met with him and studied his collections before his own trip. So we'll have more to say about the Douglas fir in part 2 of this talk. So Douglas landed at the mouth of the Columbia, but had to travel inland to Fort Vancouver. He writes, "We had 6 Indians paddling the canoe and a very strong current against us. They had paddled 40 miles without any food except water and the young shoots of Rubus spectabilis, which we know as salmonberry." Douglas says, on stepping on the shore, Gaultheria chalone was the first plant I took in my hands. He says it's called by the natives Salau. It was immediately recognized from Menzies specimens and the very first plant collected by Douglas. His journal description says, it bears abundantly, fruit good, indeed by far the best in the country. Douglas preserved samples of the fruit in alcohol, intending them to send them back to England. But later he writes, I am sorry that I have it not in my power to send specimens of the fruit in spirits with the ship. His prepared sample, he says, was by some evil disposed person stolen for the sake of the spirits they were in. Somebody drank his alcohol. The second plant Douglas collected was the red flowering currant, which would have been in full flower in April of 1825. In his journal, he writes, a most beautiful shrub. This exceedingly handsome plant is abundant on the rocky shores of the Columbia. And these are the actual specimens of red flowering currant and salal collected in 1825, the first two plants collected by Douglas on the Columbia. So these are the herbarium sheets that are still preserved. He writes of this plant, Aquilegia, probably canadensis, abundant in partially shaded woods. As with many species that Douglas was finding, he tried to relate them to known plants. What he found along the Columbia was Aquilegia formosa, which does resemble Aquilegia canadensis, which he would have seen on his trip to the eastern US, that this is strictly an eastern plant. Douglas describes the sticky currant as taste musty and disagreeable, causes vomiting, will never be of any use as a fruit, but a great addition to the ornamental garden. And of the salmonberry, he says, this very beautiful and abundant bearing species would above all others be a valuable addition to the garden. Oregon grape was among these early collections. In fact, he found 2 species of the Mahonia. But strangely, he makes no mention at all of the fruit of the Oregon grape. One day he records, I was very hungry in the evening and went out and gathered a few berries of Arbutus uva ursi, being the only thing which could be found at this place. Now, this at the time, this was known as Arbutus uva ursi. Now we call it Arctostaphylos uva ursi. So continuing on that same entry, Douglas writes, the following day, providentially, I killed 5 ducks with 1 shot. The long gun he carried could be loaded with a single ball for animals or buckshot for birds. We, of course, have no contemporary portraits of Douglas at this time in his travels at least, but that hasn't stopped artists from creating various images of what he might have looked like. Douglas traveled by canoe and on horseback and on foot. He also joined various trading expeditions to other Hudson's Bay Company posts, and he often hired local guides, both white and native. But he traveled often completely alone. He was so intent on finding new specimens that he often didn't stop to eat or drink. He used horses when available, but more often he walked. His journal records, I had to cross a plain 19 miles on foot without a drop of water, the thermometer in the shade 97 degrees, and scarcely can I tell the state of my feet in the evening. All the upper part of them were in one blister. But he records, on my journeys, I most commonly sleep under the shade of a pine tree without anything, meaning without a tent. He goes on, in England, people shudder at the idea of sleeping with a window open. Here, each individual takes his blanket and with all the complacency of mind that can be imagined, throws himself on the sand or under a bush, just as if he was going to bed. Now, as we'll see later on, Douglas would lose his complacency about sleeping rough. All the natives that Douglas encountered were not friendly, but if he was given half a chance, he had an extraordinary ability to create successful, friendly relationships with the various tribes that he encountered. He even learned the Chinook language. For their part, the natives regarded him as odd but harmless. They called him Grassman because of his incomprehensible habit of collecting what to them were useless bits of grass. He further mystified his native friends by lighting his pipe with the sun, using his botanical magnifier, and also by drinking boiling water, which he created by dissolving effervescent salts in cold water. But he says, but above all, to place a pair of spectacles on the nose is beyond all their comprehension. He still, in April 1825, he comments, Lilium puticum, the yellow bell, is abundant on the plains. Bulbs of the plant are eaten in a boiled state by the natives. Calypso borealis, plentiful in thick, shady pine woods among moss in April. And he describes the bearberry as abundant on all rocky, dry situations. The leaves, when dried over a fire, are smoked by the natives. Now, typical of Douglas' excursions from Fort Vancouver, he writes on June 20th, towards midday, left my residence for a journey up the river with the canoes going to the different posts in the interior, about 200 miles from the ocean. Among his observations from the canoe, he remarks on trees 5 feet in diameter. And he writes, this being the fishing season, the natives are numerous on the banks. A scoop net on a pole 12 or 15 feet is all that is used. By this means, an almost incredible number of salmon are caught. 30 years before Douglas, Lewis and Clark had been the first white men to travel across the US and reach the mouth of the Columbia. Douglas had studied their collections on his previous trip to the eastern US and immediately recognized this species. The genus was named for William Clark, and Douglas comments, an exceedingly beautiful plant. I hope it may grow in England. To me, this is one of the most beautiful native plants in British Columbia. And Douglas was the first to collect it, and he later made the scientific description. And in Oregon, he even found the rare and extremely beautiful variety maculosus. Now, I have a bit of an obsession with Mariposa lilies. I've made numerous trips to the Western US, searching out various species. I kind of had it in the back of my mind that I would like to photograph every species in the genus. I'm about halfway at this point. So anyway, Douglas shipped the Mariposa bulbs to England, and by the time he himself returned, they were already blooming in Chiswick Gardens. We think of Douglas as a botanist, but it's often forgotten that he was collecting bird and animal skins as well as plants. So Douglas made the first scientific collection of a sooty grouse, used to be known as blue grouse, among many other birds. Douglas makes numerous references to the difficulties of keeping himself and his collections dry in the almost continuous rain. But in spite of it all, he is still able to write, "With a basin of tea, a small piece of biscuit, and now and then a duck, I managed to live very well." On another day, he comments on the hospitality of a local chief. Douglas says, he then took me to one of his large canoes in which lay a sturgeon 10 feet long. He afforded me the most comfortable meal I had had for a considerable time before. After the meal, one of the chief's men began to show off. Douglas writes, he passed arrows through a small hoop of grass 6 inches in diameter, thrown in the air by another person. And then Douglas goes on to say, with his gun, he placed a ball within an inch of a mark at a distance of 110 yards. He said, no chief from King George could shoot like him. But Douglas was up to the challenge. He writes, of shooting on the wing, they have no idea. A large eagle was perched on a stump. I charged my gun with swan shot, walked up to 45 yards, threw a stone to raise him, and when flying, brought him down. This had the desired effects, he says. Challenged further by the first marksman, who threw his hat in the air, Douglas says, I carried the whole crown away, leaving only the brim. And he says, my fame was sounded through the camp. Douglas truly admired the natives that he encountered. Of one visit, he records, in the lodge were some baskets and hats of very fine workmanship, the maker being a little girl of 12 years of age. And of course, he noted the plants that were used for weaving, which included cedar roots and bulrush leaves. His good feeling towards the natives were reciprocated. On another day, Douglas was able to write, my visit was the first ever made without a guard. Douglas had planned to spend another year in North America, but in late September, a ship was returning to England from the Columbia, and he sends his collections with the ship, and they arrive safely in England. And there, Douglas' collections create a sensation, which he, of course, is unaware of. Throughout the winter of 1825, 1826, Douglas continues to make excursions, usually in the company of a native guide. Douglas genuinely likes and admires the native peoples he met, as his journal entries often express admiration and humor regarding them. Commenting on one guide, Muxie's surprising refusal of a drink of alcohol, Douglas says, I inquired the reason when he informed me with much merriment that some years since he got drunk and became very quarrelsome in his village, so much so that the young men had to bind his hands and feet, which he took as an affront. Douglas goes on to say, in spite of that, I found him an expensive companion in the way of smoking. So greedily would he seize the pipe and inhale any particle of smoke. Winter travel in the Northwest has changed Douglas' previous cavalier attitude about sleeping on the ground with only a blanket. On November 4th, he writes, I arrived again at Fort Vancouver at 11:30 at night, being absent 25 days, during which I experienced more fatigue and misery and gleaned less than any other trip I have had in the country. On November 18th, he writes, at midday, the Express, consisting of 2 boats and 40 men, arrived from Hudson's Bay, which they left on the 21st of July. The Hudson's Bay Company Express took 4 months to cross the continent, which it did twice a year. Douglas was disappointed that they brought no letters for him from England. And in part 2, we'll have a lot more to say about the Express. On December 24th, he reports that torrential rain has flooded his hut, made of cedar bark, to a depth of 14 inches. So during that winter, he concentrates on animal and bird collections. He observes a blue jay that is very distinct from anything that's known at the time. And thus, Douglas is the first to make a scientific collection of the Steller's jay. He records that they are seldom seen in flocks larger than 30 or 40 birds together. Now, this is significant because now you are lucky if you see 3 or 4 birds together. It's a very clear indication of how the abundance of this particular species has declined. So in Douglas' first 6 months, he had collected 499 new species with up to 24 specimens of each. So Douglas prepares his specimens again to be sent by ship to England. This time, included in the shipment were 2 20-foot logs of the Douglas fir. The quality of the wood made a huge impression, so Douglas' return with seeds the following year was eagerly anticipated. Douglas once again sets off, this time heading south into Oregon with the object of reaching the Umpqua River. On just their second day of travel, their canoe was damaged, and while he waited for repairs, Douglas collected seeds of this penstemon. Richardson's penstemon would eventually be described by Douglas after the trip. And this is an unusual color for a penstemon in BC, at least a native penstemon. And although it's not considered rare, I've only ever seen 1 plant of it, and this was near the parking lot for the Cathedral Lakes. I made this photograph in 1976, and the plant is unique enough that I still remember the occasion. Ordinarily, penstemons drive me nuts. The vast majority of them are blue and they all look the same. So it's very difficult to tell what species you have. So they're traveling south through Oregon. They continue on horseback, and for 5 days they're forced to travel through a burnt forest, which offered no plants to collect, no grazing for the horses, and very few deer to feed the men. Douglas writes, "We are just living hand to mouth." Some excitement was provided by a grizzly attack that nearly killed 1 man. Douglas says, very fortunately, his clothing was not strong, or he must have perished. His blanket, coat, trousers were almost torn to pieces. So apparently the torn clothing had allowed the man time to climb a tree. So it's October 1826. After 5 weeks of difficult travel from Fort Vancouver, Douglas is finally able to record, on reaching the summit of the last hill, the desired sight of the Umpqua River presented itself to our view, flowing through highly decorated country. A year and a half earlier, in May 1825, Douglas had recorded, "In the tobacco pouches of the Indians, I found the seeds of a remarkably large pine, which they eat as nuts, and from whom I learned it existed in the mountains to the south. Their kernel is sweet and very pleasant to the taste." The seeds were from a tree known as the sugar pine. This difficult 5-week journey to the Umpqua was directed at finding the sugar pine, but the trees were not immediately obvious. Continuing his search along the Umpqua River, on Wednesday, October 25th, he records, "Last night was one of the most dreadful I ever witnessed. My tent was blown down about my ears at midnight, when I lay in my wet blanket and the drenched tent piled above me till morning." He goes on, "Sleep, of course, was not to be had. Every few minutes, immense trees falling produced a crash as if the earth was cleaving asunder." He continues, "The rain falling in torrents, while peals of thunder and vivid flashes of forky lightning produced a sensation of terror. Even my poor horses were cowering by my side." Each day, Douglas hiked out from their current camp in search of seeds to collect. On October 26th, he writes, "About an hour's walk from my camp, I met an Indian who, on discovering me, strung his bow." Douglas' ability to form friendly relationships once again pays off. He says, "I laid my gun on the ground at my feet and waved my hand for him to come to me, which he did with great caution. I made him place his bow and quiver beside my gun, and then struck a light and gave him to smoke." Having smoked a pipe together, Douglas continues his description of the event. "With my pencil, I made a rough sketch of the cone and pine I wanted. He instantly pointed to the hills about 15 miles to the south, and seemingly with much goodwill went with me." So Douglas is now about to finally locate the source of the seeds he's been thinking about for more than a year and a half. And he records the reason for the name sugar pine. "The resin which it exudes from the trees when they are partly burned acquires a sweet taste, in which state it is used by the natives as sugar." He says, "At midday, I reached my long-wished pinus and lost no time in endeavoring to collect specimens and seeds." And he writes, he records the trees are reaching a height of 245 feet and 57 feet in circumference. And the cones are up to 16 and a half inches long. And it's the cones that Douglas needs in order to collect the seeds. The trouble is, the cones are hundreds of feet above him. And he says, "And putting myself in possession of 3 cones nearly brought my life to an end." So he proceeds to shoot down the cones. He says, "I took my gun and was busy clipping them with ball when 8 Indians came at the report of my gun and seemed to me anything but friendly." These 8 Indians were heavily armed and wearing war paint. There followed a 10-minute armed standoff till one made a sign for tobacco. Douglas says, which I said they should get if they fetched me some cones. They went, and I picked up my 3 cones and made a quick retreat to my camp. Now, I said that I'm kind of obsessed with Mariposa lilies, with Calicornis. And a few years ago, I made my own pilgrimage to the Umpqua Valley. And like Douglas, I was in search of a single species, and that was the beautiful and rare Umpqua Mariposa lily. Douglas did not find this plant, and in fact, it wasn't discovered until 1989. I traveled only one day to cover the distance that Douglas required 5 weeks for in 1826. Throughout his trip to the Umpqua and for weeks following his return to Fort Vancouver, he continued to collect bird and animal skins and make drawings in his notebooks. This was Douglas' last excursion for 1826, so we're going to leave him at Fort Vancouver for now. In part 2, we'll continue to follow Douglas' adventures as he travels back to England, and then his disastrous second trip to the West Coast. The misfortunes of that trip included an accident near Prince George that nearly ended his life. So that's the end of part 1.